All right, good evening, everyone. It's Saturday night. Whenever I'm not busy on Saturday nights, I think I want to do live streams like this. Keep it kind of open-ended on what to talk about, although I certainly have some ideas. Um, I met a guy last night, actually, who, uh, as we were having dinner and getting to talking to each other, um, we found out that we were both Boy Scouts. So that's always interesting when you find somebody that you have something like that in common with. And talking to him made me think a lot more about the organization. Now, obviously, I was in Boy Scouts, and it was a fairly significant part of my upbringing. It was probably my main extracurricular activity. Um, uh, and subsequently, I'm not active anymore, and I haven't been since I left scouting when I was 18. But I found it a really interesting organization, just culturally and economically, just how it's organized, how it grew, how it's fallen, how it's declined. And now, uh, I think what's most interesting about it is how it's being torn apart because of the cultural divisions that are kind of fracturing the United States, if not politically at this point, certainly culturally. So, which is not something that I kind of was aware of at the time, and not how I thought the Boy Scouts would go, but that is how it's going now. So let me just get the title set up here. There we go. So let me just get the awesome. All right, good to go. So, tie me in a knot. Yeah, I've actually forgotten most of the knots. I have no volume yet. It's fine. I hear. Okay. Yep. I think it's working. So, uh, I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole history of the Boy Scouts because it's been around forever. But it was my kind of intuition in the last 10, 15 years that there was this going to be this assault on the Boy Scouts from the government and in the name of or against freedom of association. So there were a series of these cases against the Boy Scouts because the Boy Scouts would not allow gays, they would not allow atheists. They're pretty open about other religions. Pretty much any other religion was fine. A belief in nature, um, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, all the various sects of Christianity, Scientology, um, LDS. In fact, we'll get to the LDS here in a minute because they're actually really important in this story. Um, and uh, like I said, even a belief in nature, but you couldn't be an atheist. I don't think they said you could be a Satanist either, but if you can believe in nature, then you're getting pretty close to that, to at least a pagan anyway. And then they would not. I mean, first they wouldn't allow gay Boy Scouts, and then they wouldn't allow gay Boy Scout leaders. And there were a series of uh, of court cases, and it seemed like my perspective was always, well, it's a private organization, they can have freedom of association, but of course that's not the society that we live in. Many people in our society have quite expansive views of what they think, what and where they think people can be forced to associate, and so does the government. Now, most of those cases came out in favor of the Boy Scouts, saying that they weren't required to do freedom of association, and so all's well on that front. So as far as it goes. But there's a deeper problem, and that is that the Boy Scouts is a national organization that is even as it has shrunk in terms of absolute numbers, but not so much in terms of geographically speaking. So it's still spread across the entire country, and it is drawing kids from California to Maine, Washington to Florida, and there's enormous cultural divisions within that, and those cultural divisions are no longer all comfortable. So you have classically, maybe 20 years ago, you started to have this phenomenon where, in protest against the exclusionary gay policies of the BSA, prominent Eagle Scouts like Steven Spielberg, for instance, were giving up their eagles. Now that is a purely symbolic thing. Giving up an eagle doesn't technically change the organization in any way, but it was a very the Eagle Scout is kind of the only thing that the Boy Scouts have going for it. And that's a whole other side tangent, but uh, one of the only things about Boy Scouts that is widely known throughout society and for which it has respect is the Eagle Scout rank. Almost everyone's heard of Eagle Scouts. Eagle Scout is something that people have an awareness of and an appreciation of, and really, what's quite interesting is it's become the thing that Boy Scouts are banking on. A lot of people who are in Boy Scouts now are in Boy Scouts because they want to get an Eagle rank. Now, Eagle ranks can help you on college admissions. They can help you in the military. I don't know if this is still true, but it used to be the case that if you joined the military, it would bump you up one rank. So not you wouldn't become a general or a colonel, but instead of an E6, you'd be an E5 or whatever. Um, I don't know if that's still true, but it was true for a long time. But it certainly helps if you are applying for college and whatnot. So now, if you look in the first 2 or 3 decades of the Eagle Scout Eagle Award, it was something like 1/10 of 1% or 1/100th of 1% of scouts were getting it. Very few. It was basically an award to people who went above and beyond normal scouting. And as those that small vanguard gained accolades and prominence, other people started to follow suit, and so more and more people started getting Eagle Scout. And when I was in Boy Scouts, there's a lot of this iconography and poetry and ceremony around the rank, and they were saying stuff along the lines of it's 1 in 100 Boy Scouts becomes an Eagle Scout, and that was true like in the 1950s. But by the time I was in it, that had really upped, and so now I think it's more like 25 or 30% of Boy Scouts who stay with it will gain the Eagle Scout, and so Boy Scouts has kind of become this resume generating um, Eagle Scout mill. Now that is not ostensibly its purpose, and that's not its only purpose. I didn't get an Eagle Scout, and I felt like I had a tremendous experience, and that's actually one of the things I kind of came away with this conversation last night, having dinner with this guy. Not only did this guy, if any of you are Eagle Scouts, you'll understand this. This guy got an Eagle Scout when he was 14, and then he got 11 Eagle Palms, and he earned every single merit badge that was possible when he was in Scouts. Um, and yet he had no friends in Scouts. He wasn't friends with anyone. He did not enjoy his time in Boy Scouts. He didn't like camping. He didn't like doing any of the other activities. It was just this thing for him to get accolades for. That's the only thing he cared about. He felt snubbed because there wasn't he wasn't on TV. Typically, if he had been a little bit younger, he probably would have, because gay teens who get all their merit badges have a good chance of being on CNN. But yeah, his uh, one of the youngest Eagle Scouts in history. So there's that's kind of interesting. How young can you be to be an Eagle Scout? Because it's basically there's a series of requirements you have to get that the time starts. I know you didn't ask this question, Jared, but since you brought it up, I'm gonna say that when you become a Boy Scout, and so there's different times when you become a Boy Scout. You can be 12, you can be in 6th grade, or you can attain the highest rank in Cub Scouts, which is called the Order of the Arrow. And to get the Order of the Arrow, you can be in 5th grade, and I'm not sure what the age requirement. So basically, you're probably going to be 11 or 12. There might be a case of somebody being 10, but that would be very rare. And I believe it takes something like at least a year, but probably like more like a year and a half to gain Eagle Scout from then if you do everything right. And there are people who do that, and your friend says that, but to be honest, Jared, I've many times encountered people who say that they know somebody or they are from a troop where that happened. So it was something that a lot of people were kind of going for. But I would look back at my time and say I had a great time. I made a lot of friends. I really grew a lot. I did a lot of hiking, and I said I'm glad that I summited Mount Baldy in New Mexico. I value that more than all of your Eagle Palms, because the Eagle Palms don't really mean anything. So it's interesting, but like this has kind of become the main reasons. If we have parents micromanaging their kids and saying everything that our kids do needs to be garnered towards college admissions, Eagle Scouts and Boy Scouts has this thing. Hey, yes, you're not going to have to know knots. You're not going to have to know how to camp. But by the way, these are all actually good skills to have, and learning how to be responsible for yourself, assuming that you're in a troop that makes you do that. Um, and is there an economics merit badge? Yes. So There's no economics merit badges, but there's citizenship in the world, citizenship in the nation, citizenship in the community. There might be an accounting merit badge. There's about 120 um, in any given year, but most of them are going to be about like first aid, cooking, backpacking, hiking, canoeing, physical fitness, um, environmental science. There is a but there's also a nuclear physics merit badge, and there's a fascinating story in urban legend, but it's actually true about a Boy Scout who got that nuclear physics merit badge, and then created a nuclear reactor in his mom's shed. But so uh, this very tangentially, but basically what you have is you have a lot of the left-wing Boy Scouts who are not okay. Archery, rifle, shotgun, yep. Small boat sailing, canoeing, kayaking, um, wilderness survival's one. Yeah, well, and that's the thing. So you have like Boy Scout troops in say New York State or in California, New Jersey, and or Massachusetts who they want gays to be included, and they want to have it. They might want women to be included. They certainly want trans people included. But then you have a lot of Boy Scout troops, say from the LDS, and the LDS is the largest single contingent and the fastest growing. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jared, but I'm pretty certain that kind of LDS has as a policy that the Boy Scouts are the official youth organization of the LDS. And so, interesting statistic: the state with the most Eagle Scouts per year is California, but number two is Utah, which, if we were just going off of population, would make absolutely no sense. Um, but it's because it's such an ingrained part of the LDS apparently. Um, well, I'm asking you, you should tell me were you in Boy Scouts or not, like actively. Um, but so you have churches like the LDS and other churches, Baptist churches, Methodist churches, Catholic churches, who are definitely not on board with gays being in the organization. And so the national organization is left in this dilemma where you have two groups with mutually exclusive views. And of course, the most flashpoint has been on gays. Now the dispute will be on girls. And I will just say here, the girls are now in Boy Scouts. It's no longer called Boy Scouts; it's called Scouts. And uh, you were in Boy Scouts. Yeah, I figured you were since you were LDS. Um, the uh, so the LDS Church left Scouts. Yeah, this is the problem. Um, you have these mutually exclusive ideologies, and and not only mutually exclusive, but they can't tolerate the other ones. And this is one of the things that I used to say about Boy Scouts in some of my earlier videos about it, is it is actually a fairly decentralized organization. Almost all the organization happens at the troop level, at the local community. And so there might be a national policy on gays, there might be a national policy on girls, there might be a national policy on whatever, on religious texts or atheists. But it really matters at the troop level. So in my troop, for instance, there were scouts that were like known to be gay. Not me, I was not acting like I was gay, but there were other ones who were, and nobody cared and it wasn't a big issue. Nobody was saying we need to get rid of this guy because he's gay. I was known to be atheist, and I not only was known, I was outspoken. I debated with our scoutmaster about it a couple times, and at no point did he say, "Listen, you can believe what you want to believe, but this is Boy Scouts, and if you're going to be an atheist, you can't be in Boy Scouts." So they didn't really care in my troop, but I do know that in other troops it just wasn't that way. There was an adjacent troop who there was a boy who was totally not gay, was totally straight, but he decided to get two earrings when he was 15. And the scoutmaster said, I will not allow any fags in my troop, and kicked him out, even though he's not gay. He wasn't claiming to be gay, and getting two earrings is not a gay symbol. Close enough for horseshoes in this case, though. And so, and again, you'd have Boy Scout troops that were like practically paramilitary, where they wore camo and all they did is survivalist stuff. But you had other troops that were more into ceremony and doing flags on parade and honor camps, and then you had others that were very urban. The dysfunctional troops that did very little. So there's a lot of variation, and I used to think, well, this is a great advantage of the organization, and it is. But the problem is that the cultures have become so disparate that the liberal Boy Scouts in California cannot stand to be in the same organization, even if their troops allow gays or don't allow gays. that they would still be affiliated with an organization that doesn't is unacceptable. And I will say on the right wing side as well, the LDS, the Catholic Church, some of the other denominations absolutely categorically cannot tolerate there being gays. And it was basically, if this if the Boy Scouts tolerate gays, then they're going to leave, and that's what's happening. So the organization is fracturing. So I think that this is kind of like the canary in the coal mine for the United States culturally, where we just have very divergent cultures, and it's too simplistic to say there's only two. There's lots, but there are kind of two large conglomerations, and they are getting increasingly less able to get along, and it's tearing apart organizations like the Boy Scouts. And not to say that this is a prelude to the Civil War, but you saw a very similar thing happen with the various national denominations um, into before the Civil War, right? So you had the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church in the United States, and they split on the issue of slavery in that case. So the northern churches started saying, hey, slavery's wrong. The southern ones started saying it was right. And those churches simply divided because you could not have these two variant ideologies in the same thing. It was letting girls in that broke the back. That could be it. That's another interesting thing is I would have thought if you had asked me 10 years ago, well, there's a good chance the government will come and tell the Boy Scouts that they have to allow girls because of they don't respect freedom of association. That's not actually apparently what happened. It's more of a case of Boy Scouts was losing about 10% of its members per year consistently, and they were desperate for new members, and they just knew that there was this well of girls who were interested. A lot of them are siblings. They have brothers who are in Boy Scouts, and so they said, "Well, we could probably snag a couple 100,000 girls," and that's exactly what they did. And of course, the organization that was most against this and most backstabbed by it was the Girl Scouts of America, right? Because basically, if Boy Scouts of America just becomes Scouts and will accept both, then Girl Scouts of America becomes a completely redundant organization. So now we're verging into another, and this is why I'm making a video on this topic, because it crosses into so many different territories of, you know, the inclusion, the mixing of male and female in organizations to the point where they will, in many cases, just mean the extinction of the female version of that, right? If male to female athletes can compete with females, that is the end of female athletics, essentially, for many sports and in many types of ways. Now, again, if we had a freedom of association, if we just allowed various organizations to decide for themselves who can play, who cannot play, who can be a part, this would not be a problem. And you could have them say, look, you can call yourself whatever you want, but if you want to play, if you want to weightlift or wrestle in this league, you can't have an X chromosome. You know, that would be fine. But our society does not allow that level of toleration or that level of discrimination, and I mean that in a good sense, or in terms of association. And so now we have forced these questions to be answered for everyone. In some cases by law, in other cases just by culture. Yeah, female sports are dead, and the Girl Scouts are dead too. They are screwed. Girl Scouts are completely screwed now, and it's not going to help the Boy Scouts either, because I think that one of the virtues of Boy Scouts was having it be this unisex environment where you didn't have to deal with the dynamics and the distractions of there being girls there. And that's why it made sense to have a parallel, similar organization. And uh, now it's going to up the membership of the Boy Scouts, and the Boy Scouts is going to change, and the Boy Scouts has better legs than Girl Scouts, but Girl Scouts is completely screwed now. Because why would you be in the lesser known? There is no Eagle Scout, right? They have an equivalent in Girl Scouts. They have their, I forget what it's called, but they have their highest ranking badge, and I don't even know what it's called. And here I'm this aficionado of the subject because it's just not as well known. It's just not as well respected. If you have the highest ranking Girl Scouts and you apply for college, they're going to be like, we don't care. So what are they going to do now? They're going to join. And if you go to the Boy Scout subreddit, which is where I've kind of been picking up on all of this stuff, I forget how I ended up reading there, but now all the posts are like, hey, all four of us got our tenderfoot today, and it's a picture of four like 12-year-old girls. Yeah, I read an article, top three female 800-meter runners, I believe, are all intersex. Odds of that randomly happening are in the billions. It's not random. It's just, and there's certain sports where the advantages aren't necessarily all in the hands of males. Some types of gymnastics or diving or whatever. But and I may even be wrong about that. But by and large, anything that requires explosive strength, absolute strength, durability, uh, trans females, male to females, have enormous advantages. It's like they've been on steroids their whole lives. And I wasn't an athlete, but I do jujitsu now. And when you roll against a woman, even if they're more skilled, even if they've been doing it for years and years and years longer than you, they just absolutely have no chance, like none. The difference in strength alone just makes it. It's not even like it's fun. Like we have fun. Like we still can have fun and still learn something by practicing the movements, but it is not competitive. Like you know that you can crush them. Whereas you go against a man, even if it's a small man, right? A man who's himself small, his power is going to be much more. Um, yeah, there is. I was listening to Mark Ripito talk about this. Women have greater endurance at 85% of their maximum. So if you get a man to do a bench press at 85% of his maximum, he is going to be done after 2 or 3 sets. And sometimes girls can go set after set after set for like 20 or 30 sets. However, their maximum is significantly less as relative to their body weight. So he's maxing out at, say, 285 pounds. He can get 5, 6, 7 reps, and she's going at 110 pounds, but she can do it, all day. Well, okay, that is nice endurance, but he could crush her skull, and she could muffle his beard. So yes, there definitely are endurance things. Intersex females normally have interior testicles. Okay, that was random. Do you work out, or are you just naturally able to overpower them? Well, I do work out, but I think that the difference is significantly enough that even if I did not work out, I would be able to do that because it's just a huge difference. It's just an enormous difference, uh, and that's with them having significantly more experience than me. Like double the amount of training. One of the ones I'm thinking about, she actually teaches the class for women. There's a class just for women. And so she knows the techniques very well. And it is fun rolling with her because she does know techniques, but I can just power through anything that she does. And and this is without even really trying that hard. So yes, I do work out, but even if I didn't, I think it would be. And look, there's bell curves here, so you put me in there with Ronda Rousey, she's going to beat the shit out of me. I don't doubt that for 1 second. But she's way, way, way up the bell curve. Um, and I'm not. I'm like an average dude. So, huh. Oh, okay, but they have testicles, so they've got testosterone going through their system or whatever. I mean, that's like being on steroids, though. I mean, if a man takes testosterone, it's considered performance enhancing. Honestly, you think I'm too big for Ronda? She's got good judo. I'm pretty sure she could throw me, and then she would break my arm. That's what I think. I could be wrong, but I think I would be deceiving myself if I didn't believe that. But she's like a or she's a Olympic medalist at that, and was like a dominant longtime force in the women's UFC. So she's literally one of the strongest women that you could ever encounter. Period. Strongest in terms of fighting, not necessarily in terms of physical strength. So I don't think I could. So she's as far up as the bell curve as you can go on that, and I would not put myself. She's old hat. Yes, that's true. Oh, and thank you, visitor. Thank you for the donation. I see that. Assuming that's you still. So I'm 6'2". Yeah, and like I yeah. Well, a lot of people think Ronda was kind of like a pioneer, and so it's kind of like the early UFC where they didn't really know what worked and what didn't work. So there was a lot of Yahooism going on, and now it's much more of a science. I just watched the UFC is now publishing on their YouTube channel a lot of the old UFC is incomplete, and so you can just go watch UFC 1, UFC 2, UFC 3, and it is kind of funny because you got like the sumo wrestler versus the pancrase fighter versus the boxer with one glove. Those kind of weird to see that early. I think it took them about 6 or 7 years to really figure out, more systematic systems. But anyway, that's all besides the point. The point is that Girl Scouts is screwed now, but it's not gonna stem the tide because there's this huge, like, this national organization is trying to hold together when the culture within that nation is just diverging apart. And there's a couple issues where it's pretty clear: girls and Boy Scouts, gays and Boy Scouts, religion is another one, and it's going to keep doing that. You're going to have, the Boy Scouts have a long history of kind of being a nationalistic organization, something that I didn't care for, to be honest. When I was in it, I found it very creepy, even when I was in high school. Um, but uh, you know, they always go see the president at the jamboree. The president always speaks to them, and you have at this point a large section of the country that's going to say they should not do that because the president's evil or whatever. And this was, to be fair, this was happening under Obama as well. And so you have this organization where one half is looking at the other half and saying you are just despicable. Like, and not despicable in the sense that I can still tolerate you, but despicable in the sense that, like, you're evil and I can't associate with you at any level. So I think that, again, this would work if there was more toleration. If people just said, "Hey, you do your thing, we'll do our thing, and it's not a big deal." But I think, more so on the left, but also on the right, they just can't abide by that. Uh, and and then also, of course, if they're imposing policies, then that's a little bit different. It's one thing to say live and let live, but if you categorically don't want girls in your troop, and the national organization says you have to take them, then, I mean, this is kind of interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of that going on where girls are showing up and they're just kind of being given the cold shoulder. Um, and they're trying to stagger the integration. So the idea was, well, first you'll have all girl troops and then all boy troops, and then that just practically is not always going to be possible. So you started having, integrated, like, let's see, within each troop, each patrol. So you'd have a boys patrol and a girls patrol. And so the point of a patrol is that that's going to be like your camping unit. When you sleep in a tent or whatever, it's going to be with your other patrol members. Uh, so those would be, single sex and segregated. But again, practically speaking, this is not going to work for very long because one patrol could have two or three members and another one could have three or four, and it doesn't make sense to keep them separate. So they have to mesh them together, and now you've got 12 or 13-year-old girls in in bed with 12 or 13-year-old boys, and that's now. But as they get older, it's going to be 16 to 17-year-olds, and you don't have to buy into my beliefs on, teen emancipation to have a hard time imagining what might happen in that situation. Anyway, someone's asked if of anyone who's watching, is anyone going to come to Porcfest? I've, got my tickets and I've figured out where I'm going to stay, and I'm really looking forward to it. I haven't gone in a couple years, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I don't know. It's always a good chance to get to meet people. No one's going to come just to visit me, but they may very well go to Porcfest, and that's a good chance to, meet either new people or people you've never met. The weekend is usually the best time to come. That's when most of the events happen. Um, I want to go, but I'm pretty sure I would be socially awkward. Well, Jeff, there's a lot of socially awkward people that go to Porcfest. In fact, I was just talking, in one of the gay libertarian groups I'm in. There was a guy in there who, as far as I knew, I didn't know him, but we interacted online many times. And he said, "Well, we actually met at Porcfest." And I said, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He was, very much socially awkward in his cocoon, nervous about meeting people, and he went to Porcfest and he partied with a whole bunch of, the gay libertarians, and that kind of opened up his shell a little bit. And I just totally did not remember him. But fiscally conservative and socially awkward in many cases, absolutely. Yeah, I'd rather just stay an anonymous screen name. All right, to each his own. Uh, yeah, it is kind of far. One of the problems is if you take a flight, You have to fly either Manchester or Boston, and that still puts you 2, 3 hours away. But there are forums where people are lining up travel. There's also busing that takes you pretty close. There's busing on the hour every hour from Boston Logan all the way up to near, but it's too far for an Uber. I mean, it's way up in the mountains. But again, I'm really looking forward. David Friedman's going to be there. He seems to always go. I'm assuming he just likes going, and he's commented in the past that he likes that there's a lot of women there. He just is used to libertarian events being sausage fests, and also there's a lot of children there. There's a lot of families. It's kind of it's family friendly, despite the fact that there's sex, drugs, and guns, and it's not uncommon. I mean, obviously, people with guns is quite normal, but you'll even see like kids with guns. I remember the last time I went there was this 14-year-old running around with an AK, or I'm sorry, an AR-15 on his shoulder. But there's always games, like there's always children's games going on. There's lots of women. There's lots of Liberty mamas and loose hippie libertarian women also, who are probably high. So not it's not fair, but in many cases, yes. Um, My dad gave me my first gun when I was 10. I live in Missouri. Yeah, that was I mean, that's okay. Depending where you live, that's still a thing, right? If you still live in a rural area, that's totally normal. And fathers giving their sons like a 22. My dad is not a gun owner. Like, he doesn't care about guns. He hunts with a bow, but he actually turned out he did have a 22 rifle his dad gave him when he was 8 or 9. His dad bought it at a Napa auto parts store. So it was an auto parts store that you could also buy guns. uh, I would have to think about my route from Michigan and whether those states reciprocate on CPL. Jeff, I have bad news for you because there's only two ways to drive to New Hampshire from Michigan. One is through Canada, which I am sure does not, and the other is through New York State. There is no way, there is no getting around New York State because it straddles Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and it goes all the way to New York City. So if you want to minimize, you can go through. It's kind of tricky because if you minimize the amount of time you can, if you think about the shape of New York, the quickest route to New Hampshire is just skirt the Great Lakes, go through Buffalo, and then through upstate New York, Utica, Syracuse. Uh, and that route takes you through upstate New York, which is obviously not the same as New York City. However, that means you will be in New York for about 5 or 6 hours. It's a long part of the trip, and then you'll be in Vermont and you'll be safe. Right? Once you get to Vermont, you're cool. If you go the southern route, it takes you very close to New York City. Now, the upside to that is that it's much less time in New York State. You can be in Pennsylvania almost the entire time, and then you can cross over and you'll be in Connecticut. But it's still, you can probably cross New York State depending on the traffic in less than an hour at that route. But you will be much, much closer to New York City. And when you leave the state, it won't be to Vermont, it will be to Connecticut and then to Mass. So I haven't looked, but I'm going to assume I know that Canada is not going to do reciprocity with your CCL. New York, if there are any states that don't, New York would be the state that doesn't, and then Connecticut and Mass are also states that probably don't. So, you know, there is really no way to drive to New Hampshire from Michigan without crossing a state that doesn't allow it. There's like do they allow any form of firearm transport like locked in the trunk unloaded? Well, yes, that's legal. I mean, you'll have to look this up, but there's this principle, I forget the name, but basically, regardless of what a state's gun laws are, if it is legal where you are and it is legal where you are going, then the states have to permit you to cross through, right? So New York State can't say nobody can drive through here with a semi-automatic rifle that's banned in New York because if it's legal, and Jeff, I know exactly where you're coming from because I moved from Michigan to New Hampshire. And when I did it, I had a pickup truck with 25 guns in it in the back with ammo, right? So needless to say, I was very worried that if I got pulled over, shit, a lot of that shit is not legal in New York. Now, I had Michigan plates. I have the argument that I was going to New Hampshire, and I think this is a case that was perfectly legal, and I could have gone to court on it. But there's no question, as is always the case, that if the cops pull you over, they can give you a lot of trouble. And if the cops in Michigan pull you over and you say, "Hey, I've got some rifles in the back," they're not going to care. Probably they're not. They're probably not going to care. But in New York State, it could be a different question. So, um, like New England, if you're talking northern New England is fine. New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine are all constitutional carry at this point. They're better than Michigan when it comes to gun rights, and most of those states have decent gun ownership rates and few, if any, laws. Vermont famously never had any state gun laws up until very recently, and they're still quite small. And New Hampshire and Maine have been going in the direction of abolishing all their gun laws, and they're pretty much there. But southern New England, Mass, Connecticut, Rhode Island, they're not so friendly. And then New York is almost unfriendly as you can get. So it is legal, but you definitely should not carry it on your side. If it's locked and unloaded in your trunk, you're probably okay. But do not concealed carry through the state of New York. Unless I could be wrong, there's a chance they have reciprocity, but I think it's very low because they're going to be one of the states that's like they don't believe in it, and they're going to be pretty anal about, because so you can check, but that's the sad news is uh, all of New England is cut off from the rest of the country by the state of New York. Trust me. It's been tricky too because another state that's really bad that is at a choke point on a lot of highways is Illinois. So Indiana's fine, Wisconsin's fine, Missouri's fine, Iowa's fine, Kentucky's fine, but right in the middle is Illinois, and Illinois is definitely not fine. So I can't not get around Illinois, but my protest is I always fill my gas tank in Indiana, cross Illinois, and then I won't fill it up again until I get to Iowa 80 in Iowa or to Wisconsin. Connecticut may as well be New York when it comes to gun. Yeah, it might even be worse after Sandy Hook. So Connecticut's one of the worst states. New York's one of the worst states. Um, Mass is not as bad as those two, but it's pretty bad relative to others. But then if you can make it to New Hampshire, Vermont, or Maine, you're good. It's been awkward. There's actually a lot in New Hampshire. There's a lot of gun ranges on the border with Mass, and there's a lot of people from Mass who have membership in those ranges and actually will keep their guns in New Hampshire. And but when I've gone shooting at some of those ranges, I've been warned, hey, when you drive home, the quickest route to go home would actually take you to drive through parts of Mass, even though this would be like rural northern Mass, not Boston or anything like that. But like, do not do it because if you get pulled over, like all the stuff that you were just shooting is illegal in Mass. And sure, you're traveling, and that should be legal, and it is technically legal, but tell that to the cop who pulls you over. So Vermont is my favorite state. Okay, Vermont though. Okay, I give Vermont a lot of credit for never having had gun laws, and they've had constitutional carry all along before anyone else. They never got away with it, so that's awesome. But Vermont is very socialist, very left wing. They have super high taxes. They have super stringent regulations on like corporations. So there's not one Walmart in the entire state. There's no billboards allowed, and so if you go on the border with Vermont and New Hampshire, every time, and it's the border is basically the Connecticut River along the entire length of the border, and there's always wherever there's a road crossing, uh, there'll be a town on the Vermont side and a town on the New Hampshire side. The New Hampshire town will always be bigger, and the New Hampshire town will always have all these businesses and restaurants and everything because there's no sales tax in New Hampshire, and they don't have near as many as regulations as Vermont. So a lot of businesses just say, well, fuck it, we're going to be in New Hampshire. What's even worse about Vermont is they assume, because they have high sales taxes, they assume that if you live close to the border with New Hampshire, that you are crossing the border to do your shopping to avoid the sales taxes. So you have to pay a punitive tax if you live within a certain number of miles of the border. And you can avoid the tax if you can prove that you didn't buy anything in New Hampshire. So I'd just like for all of you to let that sink in. How do you prove that you didn't buy anything in New Hampshire? Do I live in New England? Yeah, I've lived in New Hampshire for 5 years. I just went up to Maine last week, and it's been one of the nice things about living here is getting to explore all this stuff. So you have to understand New England's the oldest part of the country, and it's one of the most particularized areas. So there's notable differences between Vermont and New Hampshire and Mass and Maine. Part of it is a bigotry of small differences, distinctions, but it is actually a really cool area. There's a Walmart in Vermont near Burlington. Well, I've never seen it. Pro-gun but socialist. Well, you got to. They've never had a crime problem, and they've kind of had a big hunting culture and a big farm culture, and no big cities. The biggest cities there, I think, are like 20 or 30,000 people. Um, so you're from Saginaw? Fuck no. No, I've only even been to Saginaw once or twice. I was from up north. I was from northern Michigan. Saginaw, no. But yeah, you can get, look, people bring their guns to Porcfest, and people in New York bring their. I've seen people who live in New York City with handguns at Porcfest. So there's a way to do it. Uh, but I never said I lived in Saginaw because I never lived in Saginaw. In fact, I don't think I've ever like, I've driven through it. I don't think I've ever actually even stopped there. Saginaw has, I don't know if this is still true, but it's one of the highest per capita murder cities in the United States too, I believe. Like it's worse than Detroit and it's worse than Flint. I was at, I was in Walmart in Wilmington, Vermont. Okay, there you go. So maybe they do have Walmarts. But you know what I'm saying, on the borders, there's always a bigger town on the New Hampshire side. There's always more businesses. And I do know that they don't allow billboards. Although to be fair, they're rare in New Hampshire as well. Um, and you get the same phenomenon on the border with Mass. So the towns that border Massachusetts and New Hampshire, like Nashua, Salem, they're big towns, and they have enormous retail districts, and that is all the people from Mass coming up to avoid sales taxes. Probably like the South Park episode where everyone protests the Walmart. Yeah. Um, there's even I've heard this story several times, so I think that there's truth to it. But back in the '60s when they were first opening these malls, the governor of Massachusetts was so pissed that so many Mass people were going to New Hampshire to avoid sales taxes that they sent the Massachusetts State Police to the parking lots in some of the malls. Which, by the way, the malls they're on the border. Like in some cases, the parking lots are in Mass. Uh, but the malls themselves will always be on the New Hampshire side. But anyway, they sent the state troopers there, and they would look around for license plates from Massachusetts, and if they found any, they would wait for you to come out and then demand to see your receipt and then issue a ticket for the assessed sales tax value. And when the governor of New Hampshire found this out, he sent the state troops of New Hampshire down and said, "Get the fuck out of our state. This is none of your business," and they had to leave. Does the gays support men going their own way? Um, I get asked this question a lot, and I don't care. Like, no, I mean, support, sure. Like, should it be allowed? Sure. I don't feel like I have a dog in that fight, though. I also don't know. There's something like anti-natalist about it that I don't like. Like, there's something like, if you're a straight man and you like women, I understand why there's a lot of frustration there. I understand there's a lot of problems associated with it. There's legal problems associated with it, with marriage, and with potential for divorce. And there's a lot of legal problems associated with courting, and not, especially now with the Me Too movement and how you can be accused and you can be ruined. And like, I understand that these are all significant hazards, and that it's not just the law, it's the culture, and that a lot of women have, attitudes that could be very difficult for a man to deal with. That said, that's if that's where your happiness lies, and that's where you have to go, right? If the thing that's going to make you happy is on a dangerous island, then you have to get to the dangerous island. End of story. So I do get it, I guess, but I don't think that that's a long term solution for anyone. I think if you are a sufficiently good man, whatever that means, that you would be able to woo a woman and get past all of the hurdles. And indeed, I know some of you have done that. So it is possible, but you're going to go your own way, but you're just going to be lonely. And I mean, maybe you'll get sex or whatever, but if you want a family, like you're not going to get that from that. And so I don't see that as a long-term solution. To me, that would be like a gay person saying, "I'm going to pray the gay away." Like, it's just not going to help in the long run. Are you into hunting? I am interested in hunting, like philosophically and health wise. In fact, I'm really curious about eating different types of meat that are not available commercially typically. Um, but my interest level has not risen to the level that I've actually done it. I would not want a gun hunt. I would want a bow hunt, or maybe atlatl hunt. I've always thought that was pretty fascinating. Um, but I have just not taken the step to do it. And I also am aware of I would want to be ethical about it, so I'd have to be decent at shooting. And I was a decent shot at a bow as a kid, but it's been quite a while. Although I do have a crossbow in the closet, so who knows? Um, I think hunting is a good thing though, and I think it's part of our society that we don't want to lose. What's your advice to a loner who wants to socialize? Join a club, join a gym, start working out, start talking to people more, start going out, start making friends, uh, and don't, when you have opportunities to go out, take them and don't give yourself an excuse to stay in. Way too many people, they get opportunities and they just say, "Oh, I don't, I'll just go next time" or whatever, and they don't. So the only way to kind of develop social skills is to practice social skills, and that's to go out and practice. It's to go out and meet people and do things. And giving yourself some kind of hobby, something where you can go and whether it's playing a sport or I mean, again, it's kind of cliche, but like going to the gym, uh, whatever, playing basketball, these are all things that kind of help you. And if you're more comfortable initially, do it same sex, right? So you might feel more comfortable just with other men. Do that until they ask you to go out for beers to a bar, and then do that. Uh, is men going their own way just an excuse for other deficiencies? I'm sure it is. Wait, sorry guys, you're getting bad. I missed a question there. I will get back to that. Let's see. Connecticut will reciprocate, but Mass won't. See, you cannot get to New Hampshire without going through. If you're coming from the rest of the, if you're coming from Maine, you touch New Hampshire. If you're coming from any other part of the country, you have to go through New York, and then the routes will take you either through Vermont or Mass. Now, Vermont's not a problem. Mass is a problem. And if you go through Vermont, you have to go through New York. And if you go through the minimum amount of New York, you'll go through Connecticut. Yeah, it's basically a gun restrictive bottleneck that cuts off northern New England from the rest of the God-fearing country. Okay, now FOPA stands for fat over penis area. I don't know what you're talking about. Uh, bah, 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 bah. And yes, I would recommend jujitsu. I mean, I get to roll with women all the time. You get to go and like wrestle women or men, whatever one you like. Is men going on away excuse for other deficiencies? I'm sure it is sometimes, but not like systematically all the time. There are legitimate reasons for it. Like there's legitimate reasons to be frustrated, and again, cultural reasons and legal reasons to be frustrated with dating women that I'm very sympathetic to and totally understand. In fact, one of the things that really there's a novel I read in college called Blind Baseball, and it's a novelization of a man who goes through divorce, and it's a pretty accurate kind of representation of what that legally entails, although it's um, um, dramatized. Joe Sobran wrote, he called it the 1984 of marriage or something like that. That's how I heard about it, and so I totally sympathize. So there's a real issue there, but I don't think that it's the solution to that problem, right? New York, New York City has no handguns. Well, G. Griffin, they are probably keeping them someplace else, or they're keeping them illegally. Uh, either, or they're just borrowing them when they get to New Hampshire. Because I agree, as that was my understanding as well. But such is the market that people get away with it. Men going their own ways for dudes who can't get girls and pretend that's because they don't want to. Again, I'm assuming that is some of the time, but it also could be guys that can get girls and they do get girls, but they just don't want a relationship with them. So they don't mind hookups, they don't mind an occasional date, but they're not looking for something serious. There are definitely men like that, whether or not they identify as men going their own way or not. But yes, there's probably also a lot of people who are just socially awkward or incapable or incels or whatever. Yeah, it's real fun with divorce court for men. Yeah, absolutely. It's like they really have you by the balls in so many ways, and so I totally understand, being less than enthusiastic about the whole situation and looking for a way out. But if you want a family, if you want that, then you've got to find a way to make it work, and you can make it work. Like women have. I don't know if I should really talk about this because I don't have a lot of experience with women or much interest in them, but I'm just gonna assume that, like, evolutionarily speaking, that they're in some way wired to want a man in some capacity as a provider and as a sexual partner. And there's probably a way, if you do it right, to get past the cultural and legal counter wiring. If you can get past the software to the hardware, and that's even assuming that they're all bad, and I'm sure they're not. So you got to find the good ones. I have heard that the odds are quite bad. Like women on Tinder ignore about 85% of the guys, and it's only the top 15% who get really any attention. And so, if you're not in that top 15%, then you are left to pick up the pieces. But that gives you, I mean, you can work that much harder. You can also just try and get in the top 15%, which is a totally achievable goal. The average guy can become an above average guy in about a year, if we're talking physically, depending on where you're starting at. So, if you think abs are going to help you get women, and it probably will, you can get abs. It's not necessarily easy, but it's totally doable. Uh, would you want to hunt exotic African animals like lions and giraffes? Well, I don't have any desire to do that right now, but I don't think there's anything ethically wrong with it. Um, Hunting is it places it actually takes natural wildlife and natural ecosystems and puts a value on them being wild and natural. Because if you're not allowed to hunt them and place value on them that way, then the most valuable use of the land is going to be agricultural or pastoralism or urbanization, and that means their extinction. So hunters are what are saving the wildlife in the United States, and they're also what's helping to save the wildlife in Africa in the places where it is allowed. If an elephant has a price tag of $300,000 or whatever it is, then people are going to want elephants around. If elephants are a national treasure that can't be touched, then you have a real tragedy of the commons problem that ends with a chainsaw on a tusk and a dead elephant. And that is, I mean, that's just the reality of it. And also, these are animals, all of them, even if we're talking about elephants or giraffe, these are all animals that suffer from not only droughts and disease and famines, but they suffer from predation. They get killed by other animals. Lions can take all these animals, especially when they're young. And so, again, they do live by the law of the jungle, and I don't think that there's anything ethically wrong with a human coming in and becoming an apex predator in those scenarios. Now there is a part of me that thinks, like, I like the idea of it having a fair chance. I just find that more appealing, and so all the more for hunters to do it with a bow than with a gun. But I'm not that is totally an arbitrary line. Where do you draw it? Because you could say, well, why a bow? Why not just use an arrow without a bow, or just a knife, or your bare hands? Which I'm all for hunters who want to try and do that if they want to take their lives into their own hands. But yeah, when I see pictures like, oh, look at this person, they killed a giraffe or an elephant, I'm like, okay, that's fine. And that's even appreciating that maybe elephants are highly intelligent and social, and they have a value that's greater than an ungulate. But in their natural habitat, they get fucking torn apart by whatever crocodiles, other elephants, And I watched a really cool video, and it was an elephant that had been stabbed in the stomach by another elephant. Two bull elephants had fought, and his intestines got pulled out. And so obviously he died a horrible death, you know. And if he had been shot in the head, I wouldn't consider that so much worse. Doesn't Vermont have red flag laws? They might. I know relatively recently they passed a new gun law, and I think that might be it. But they still have constitutional carry. So red flag laws are bad, I agree, but that's not going to stop you from carrying in Vermont. No New York reciprocity whatsoever. I am not surprised by that at all. That sounds so like New York. What are your views on New Hampshire as the choice for the FSP? I've always thought it was a mistake to pick a state in New England. You have some experience with the runner-up Wyoming. Yeah, so I have a lot of experience with both, and I have met the founder of Free State Wyoming at Porcfest, William Royce, also known as Boston Tea Party. So I think that this was a point that was totally debatable. The FSP, was smart. They came up with a list of I think it was 10 potential states, and it had the 10 states that you would want on that list. So obviously, low population, high liberty states. So Alaska, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. I think South Dakota, North Dakota, New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and maybe a few others. But you wouldn't want to pick Vermont. I think was very questionable because the degree that its politics are socialist, but it's a small enough population and it's free, and in some respects that I guess I could see why that was an option. Um, Once you get larger states than that, it becomes far less likely that the numbers that you would get to move would matter. Wyoming's big claim to fame is that it's the least populated state, and it is fairly libertarian in a lot of ways. Um, so when I talked to William Royce about this at Porcfest years ago, he was saying his belief is that ultimately the reason New Hampshire was picked is because it's much closer to the East Coast, and you have a lot of libertarians who live in, say, Boston or New York City, and they would think about moving to New Hampshire, whereas they would probably not think about moving to Wyoming. And indeed, that's a big move. That's a big difference. It's like a different climate. It's a different culture. It's a different economy. Um, that said, there is a huge difference between New Hampshire and New York. There's a huge difference between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Just culturally, legally, socially, demographically, they're very, very different. Now, is it as extreme a difference? No, not necessarily, but it's not. Wyoming isn't more libertarian in every way, so it's almost a bit of a wash there. And there's also long-term geopolitical considerations. Wyoming is landlocked. Wyoming has no international border, whereas or New Hampshire has both, because New Hampshire touches both Canada and the ocean. So it has, it has ports, Portsmouth. So that's long term if you ever got to a secessionist thing or whatever. So um, I do think that this was something that could be debated, but and I told William Royce this when I met him, that I was like, hey, I think that I'm a little nervous. I was thinking in terms of survivalism, like if there was a collapse and suddenly 20 million people in New York City were starving, or 4 million people are in and around Boston, I would rather be in Wyoming than New Hampshire. But what are the odds of that happening? And what are the odds not only of that happening, but that it would matter whether you lived in Niobrara County in Wyoming versus Cheshire County in New Hampshire? So I love both states. I think they both were good candidates. I think if, uh, and here's the other thing, like if they picked Wyoming and nobody moved to Wyoming, then it doesn't do any good. If they pick New Hampshire and the people actually move here, which I think it's 4 or 5 thousand have, so we're waiting for the rest of them. Then that's a consideration that matters. And I don't think the differences politically or culturally between the two states, which do exist, are matter as much as whether or not you get people to move. Wyoming is a beautiful state, though. I'll give it that, and they are way better about communal showers. But you know that was not a consideration, and I was not one of the original signers, so I didn't get to vote. Ba-ba-ba. You can't own a gun in New York City without one of their licenses, which you can't get if you're not a resident. Not legally, but there's ways around it. You can get them other places. Connecticut isn't quite as bad as New York. Sort of bad, sort of good. Sorry, guys, I'm way behind on the on the questions. Oh, wow, I'm way behind on the questions. Sorry, guys. Jim, higher testosterone, higher confidence, easier to socialize. Yes, XM, and also a nicer body, which matters, and discipline and confidence. And Jim is just good for health. It's good for everything. Do you see Gay Pride Month as having some elements of virtue signaling? Absolutely, 100% yes. In fact, there's very little that's sincere about it at this point, I would say. It is because women are picky with men, so you have to be at the top. Tinder has created globalization for female sex. Yes, women are picky for men, and with good reason, because they get saddled with the genes and their investment. You invest sperm and a nice orgasm, and they have to invest, 9 months of their lives in the whole child rearing. So that makes perfect evolutionary sense. So if you want to not be at the bottom of the barrel with the women and playing, lose the game of musical chairs, then you should be the best that you can be. And then, and I've heard other guys say this, when it comes to politics, get past the first date, get in line with them, and then eventually they will emotionally want to kind of do what you want to do. I've even seen this with other men. I don't persuade people that I'm dating to become libertarians. I just get them to like me, and then because I am a libertarian, they feel like, well, I must be respectable. And I've had guys who, even after we broke up, they're still anarcho-capitalists because they respected me and they got into it that way. Don't preach to them on the first date, though. That is a really interesting perspective that I think I have heard before, but have not heard it stated that way. I don't know who you're referring to, visitor, if it's Jared's comment or something else. FOPA, Firearms Ownership Protection Act, which establishes travel through rules, have been talking about 1986. So, are you saying, Griffin, that I broke the law in New York when I drove across it with my guns? What are red flag laws? Red flag laws are laws where somebody can go to the court and say, we think so and so is a danger to their community and we want their gun rights revoked temporarily, usually. And of course, who gets to ask and what is the criteria for deciding and what is the criteria for undeciding could vary tremendously. But this is kind of like um, I don't know how long this idea has been around, but somebody in National Review after the Parkland shooting kind of floated this as, let's not take everyone's rights away. Let's just take the rights away of the people who we think might do something wrong. Um, Huge slippery slope issues here, huge pre-crime issues here, and the rhetoric of the gun control people would never ever be satisfied with just this. So I would see this as backdoor confiscation, backdoor nullification, and I would be very much against it. Oh, so there's the answer. That's a utilitarian argument to preserve our elephants. What do you about the rights of elephants? Do you not believe in animal rights? What is the elephant's right to never be killed? Right, they're prey animals. Like every animal is a prey animal. Like again, I when I look at a killer whale, for instance, I don't want to see a killer whale at SeaWorld because I think that they're these incredible apex predators, and I want them out there to have a fighting chance and to be doing their thing. And I would much rather see them in that environment. That said, they're just murderers. Like they're animals that go around. I mean, we're getting, oh, I feel bad because this elephant got killed. Dude, that elephant, if it's going to kill any animal that gets in its way. If it thinks that you're threatening it, even if you're not, it'll kill you. And by you, I mean any other animal. It could be predated, right? So we're kind of like, I don't know, humans don't need to become the vegans of the planet, you know? But red flag laws allow people to snitch on you and cops. Yeah, basically, that's a good way to put it, snitch on you. But he has guns, might be dangerous. Please take his guns. Yep. This is the problem because then they can just, and this is, I've heard this already started happening where people would call suicide hotlines and be like, "Hey, my friend is suicidal," and then next thing you know, like lose their gun rights. I wonder why Rhode Island stopped being the most libertarian state in the U.S. Well, first of all, it was the most libertarian colony for a while in like the 1660s. They had a revolution in 1840, and that's when they started to expand the franchise, and all hell broke loose, basically. So, Yeah, the Constitution that Rhode Island operated under the same Constitution from like 1662 until like 1840, and the number of people who could vote in Rhode Island in 1840 was like 2,000 or some ridiculously small number. So they, enlarged the franchise at that point. There was kind of like a coup. There's almost a war. Nobody died, but like guns were drawn and militia was called out and whatnot. And that's the beginning of the end of Rhode Island. But but yeah, under Roger Williams, it was not a bad place. Yeah, they take your guns and then you can go to court to convince the judge you're innocent otherwise. So it's guilty until proven innocent. Guilty until proven innocent. Yeah. Prohibited person. I want to personally thank you for your foreskin restoration videos. Great to get the word out to guys that don't know it's possible. Well, thank you, Mockingbirds. That's one of the reasons I made those videos, is because so few people are aware that that is even something that can be done. Um, the vast majority of people have never heard that that is possible. Not only is it possible, it's quite doable and quite affordable. Now, it does take time, it does take commitment, but it does not take money and it does not entail hardly any risk. And the results are potentially stupendous. The increase in your sexual pleasure and function, not to mention whatever aesthetic considerations go into it, are, um, I mean, it's one of the best things you can do, I think, especially if you're having problems with erectile dysfunction or sensitivity loss. Um, and another thing is, I think a lot of the people who are drawn to foreskin restoration and anti-circumcision and intactivism, I don't know what it is, but it's drawing people from like the social tail ends of the bell curves. And so a lot of those people, and I love them and I agree with them, but sometimes they're not the best communicators. And I'm not going to say I'm the best communicator either, but most people seem to think that I'm fairly articulate and fairly fair-minded. So I wanted to, it's something I cared about personally, and it's something I wanted to share and express with other people. And I get a lot of comments and people on those videos just saying thank you, and it really helped them. So, that's a good feeling. I will do more videos on that in the future. It's just there's only so much that can be talked about, and they also almost always, the intactivism and the foreskin restoration, they are technically separate issues, but they intersect at such a high degree that it's hard not to just get tangentially into all kinds of other topics. It's sandwiched between Mass and Connecticut. Yeah, well, it does have a. That's true. Rhode Island is a little trapped, but so is Maine. Hello, hello, troll bucks. Did libertarians want to run the country as corporation? Don't libertarians want to run the country as a corporation? No, I don't think that there are single libertarians out there that would ever characterize their position as that way. That sounds like a left-wing critique of libertarians, but not something that they would actually argue and not something that would actually describe what libertarians are talking about. Uh, FOPA should protect you in New York, but New York State doesn't recognize it. So, Giffen, do you know, has this actually gone to court? Have New York State troopers pulled anyone over for transporting legal firearms from A to B and said you can't have those here? I would like to know that. Locked in your trunk is probably a smart idea with the ammo separate, but definitely don't. I mean, I know people who are willing to risk the legal repercussions to, have that self-defense available. If you're going through upstate New York, you can do it in a single go. You don't have to spend the night. You don't have to stop. Um, you should be okay. I've done it many, 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 many times. Uh, Once with a lot of guns, many times with, maybe one. It is doable, and that is going to be way more doable than crossing the border and going through Canada, which is going to be really tricky. Don't forget that the big fish eat the small fish. Big fish do eat small fish, and big fish also die and get diseases. This is a big misconception that uh, a misunderstanding of how firms work and how capitalism works. It is absolutely true that as a firm gets bigger, it can have economies of scale, and that will give it certain advantages. It also will give it certain disadvantages. It has more capital to maintain. It has more stuff that it has to manage, to organize, to coordinate, and that becomes progressively harder the larger the organization is. And any mistake becomes significantly more costly. So if you say build a product that turns out to be a stinker, you just wasted way more money than a smaller firm. So the most profitable firms are not the largest; they're mid-range firms. And this idea that as a firm gets bigger, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. That's a simplistic way to look at it. What do you think about Texas? Well, I don't know. Texas is a lot of good and a lot of bad. I've lived there. I've worked there. I have family there. It's not really my state. It's way too hot for me. I appreciate their nationalistic feelings. I appreciate that they have an identity that's distinct from the rest of the country. I think most Americans see themselves as my Americans first, and then whatever else their state or their city less. There are exceptions to this. I think a lot of people in the LDS consider themselves Mormons first, and whatever else later. Some of the other states, like Texas, is probably the outstanding example. But it wouldn't surprise me either if like New York Cityers saw themselves as New Yorkers more than Americans. So, and I like that, right? I don't like nationalism, so I like it when there are groups within the nation that have an identity hierarchy that does not place the nation at the top. Ignoring the politics, what do you think of California? It's a beautiful state. Mormons absolutely think of themselves as Mormon first. That was my supposition, Jared. That's kind of the impression I always got, and that will always endear me to them, whatever I may or may not believe about the reality of the Book of Mormon. Um, so good for them. New York State troopers have arrested many locked up in the trunk with separate ammo. Yes, but don't know how far up the courts it has gone. Yeah, and I know John Stossel has done it. It's even worse for people like going to New York City, and this is like people who are on connection flights. So they don't even have the guns with them, but they're in their carry-on luggage and they're getting felonies. And the attitude in New York City is like, fuck you for even doing this. So they just have a terrible attitude. And this is one of the ironies of the central state that we have. This would be the argument, the counter argument to the liberals want to run everything. On a couple issues, they're going to lose, and guns is one of them. There's just too many. The traditional the blue states. Too many of the blue states are too strongly pro-gun, and so if you look at like the liberal conservative divide, the right left divide, the gun rights is not so strict about that, and there's a very large chunk of the left or of the blue states that are good on guns. And so this is if we're going to impose a national standard on the whole country based on democracy or whatever, it's going to be it would if we're talking about concealed carry, it would be um, shall issue concealed carry, right? Because you've got some states that are discretionary issue. You have any more states that are constitutional carry. So kind of the national mean is going to be shall issue, and it's going to be no restrictions on basically any type. Uh, so New York is not going to like that, but that is where things are headed because we've already had the federal government kind of impose concealed carry on Illinois, on DC, on Chicago, and New York City. I think I've even heard that they're not. There's some cases they're not. They're nervous to push it because they don't want it to go to the Supreme Court because they know that they'll lose, or it's highly likely. Isn't sodomy still illegal in Texas? You could fool that on Grind. You couldn't tell if you were on Grinder there. Um, the closer to New York City, the more likely some troopers will ignore if you are more upstate. Yeah, Griffin, that's what I think. But the problem there is the more upstate you are, the longer you are in the state. If you take I-70 or if you take I-80 and I-90 through upstate New York, it's like 5 or 6 hours. Whereas if you cut across the Tappan Zee Bridge, let's say, I think you can cross the state, depending on the traffic, in less than 1 hour. But again, that would be going from from like New Jersey, because then you would also be going through New Jersey, like New Jersey to New York to Connecticut to Mass. So I feel more comfortable going the northern route, but it is much longer, so your exposure is much greater. Uh, what do you think of Florida? Way too hot and humid. It's a crazy state. I've only gone twice. I went 2 years ago for my brother's wedding, and don't see any reason to go back. Honestly, I think most people think of themselves by their unique or discriminated against part of their person. Oh, so like I would think of myself as what? As a well, so I would think of myself as a libertarian because that's the discriminated part, not as gay because that's not discriminated. And Mormons probably would feel like, yes, we're the isolated, the other Christians don't trust us and atheists don't trust us, so we're Mormons. But they're also trained to be good Mormons and that, whatever. So, do you think people should own weapons that would be able to blow up planets? So this brings up a good question. Um, at what point does society have a veto over what you can own, right? And fortunately, we don't have anything that's like that now. So I think there becomes a question of the potential negative externalities, but that doesn't apply to machine guns or bazookas or RPGs. In fact, I would even argue that it may not apply to nukes, but that's a contentious issue. Um, should have said anti-sodomy laws are unconstitutional. New Yorkers do see New Yorkers first. It's true. Yeah, I get that impression as well. I mean, and the libertarian New Yorkers aren't bigots about it, but they still love their city. Like they don't want to leave. They love it too much. Even and look, Murray Rothbard falls into this category. Murray Rothbard didn't leave Manhattan for like 25 years. He was afraid of bridges. So they are kind of bigots in that way. But you prefer private police or no police? Well, okay, I don't think that there should be any institution that's just going out looking for people to arrest. Defense, that's different. You want to hire a defense agency, you want to hire a security guard, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But to hire someone and say your job is to go out and actively look for people to arrest, that doesn't make any sense to me. Enforcement people should be the enforcement of people who have been convicted, right? So you could have an insurance company that says they maybe have a squad of men who are like, hey, if we have arbitration and there is a trial and somebody is there's a finding against somebody that they're a tortfeasor, and we're going to send Mad Dog and his 8 buddies to go and reclaim property. I don't have a problem with that either, but there has to be a whole process there. They can't just go out there ransacking people and saying we're going to see if we can find something to pin you on. But are you and your brother close? We're getting closer, but we're still not close. Mormons are an offspring of the Freemasons. Jared, you want to chime in on that? That's new. I've never heard that one before. I imagine it has something to do with Joseph Smith, though. I don't think libertarians are discriminated. They are just mocked. Well, that feels emotionally the same, Pentazoid. Um, as an ex-Mormon myself, I can confirm that they think of themselves as Mormon first, at least typically. Right, well, there's a lot of Mormons, so I'm sure they vary in how they think of themselves. But in general, I think that they do have a strong identity. Now, the other religious denominations, they have people who feel that way as well. I'm sure there are Catholics who are Catholics first. I'm sure there are Methodists who are Methodists first. And there definitely are Jews who are Jews first. But I think that Mormons, at least among the Christian denominations, it's more common. So there's not many Methodists who are like Methodists first and foremost, relative to how many Mormons there are. Might be quite a few Catholics though. Catholicism seems to have a decent sway over a lot of its people. But Tappan Zee route is 89 miles, not New Jersey. Yeah, and I've done the Tappan Zee. It's also expensive. It's expensive either way. You're looking at a lot of tolls to go through New York. Is what's the one, G Griffin? I'm not looking, but you can go over the George Washington Bridge, and that's pretty short as well. But it's freaky to because you're going. Does it go through Manhattan? I think it does. That would be real. It's one thing to go close to New York City. It's another thing to drive through New York City. That's even worse. We're confusing Mormons with liberty. Well, there is a website, Facebook group, LDS Liberty. So, what level of stupid are people who argue that those who live in gated communities, private property, can't be for open borders at a national level? I don't. I would hesitate to say, even if that argument is stupid, it doesn't mean that the people who believe it are stupid. People just have different perspectives and different priorities, and they don't always have the most coherent thinking. That doesn't necessarily make them stupid. We all have our blind spots. Uh, More Mormon ceremonies are copies of Freemasons, absolutely. So kind of like Order of the Arrow for religion. Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormons, died in prison. Yes. Jordan Smith, Joseph Smith, not Jordan. Joseph Smith was a Freemason. I didn't know that. Not surprised. Now, did he die? He died before the Know Nothing Party came to power, though, I believe. I think that was he died in the 1830s, and I think that came about in the 1840s. Maybe that's why they were really expelled. Did we reach a consensus on how to get a gun to New Hampshire if you have to go through New York? I think that it's not a consensus, but I feel like the best way is to go the northern route on the interstate. Uh, don't speed, don't speed, don't get pulled over, and it's the shorter route overall. It's just more in New York State. But if you go the shorter, if you minimize your time in New York State, you're getting really close to New York City, and then you have to go through Connecticut, New Jersey, and Mass. George Washington is through New Jersey, Manhattan, and the Bronx. Yeah, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. And also the traffic there could be really bad, so you could end up being stuck. And the toll on the George Washington Bridge is like $25, if I'm not mistaken. Do-do. I find that amazing that has not been settled because that's a lot. That's cutting off all of New England from the rest of the country. Aw, that is nice. I've never walked it. So Griffin, do you live in New York City or near it? Such a pro-gun person living so close to the Big Apple is kind of weird. But I swear, there's a big libertarian contingent from New York City who goes to Porcfest, or at least did every year, and they open carry firearms. Now, very likely, it's apparent they either have them illegally, or they're just keeping them out of state, which is totally possible. Mormon ceremonies are copies of Mason. So, Jared, do you know that because you're also a Freemason? Like, how do you know they're copies? Are you in a lodge and or like unless you were in both, how would you know? UFC 238 about to start. Yeah, I never watched them like live. I always just watch the highlights later, and I don't even make a point to unless I hear something interesting happened. Both Mason and Mormon ceremonies are public knowledge at this point. Colin, that's what you think, but those are only the ones they want you to think are public. The real ones are all still secret. Do you know anything about Jehovah's Witnesses? Because these people are really whack. Not really. My mom had a coworker who was a Jehovah's Witness, and she was very forward about it. But I don't know that much about them. There've been, I know there's been legal controversies because they would like not get their kids vaccinated, and it was a question about whether they could be forced to or not. There's a guy on YouTube who films inside Mormon temples. He's pretty interesting character. He films them clandestinely or like officially. SCOTUS hasn't taken many Second Amendment cases, repeatedly denying Sitoroi. Yeah, I've actually heard that Clarence Thomas has complained about this. The Clarence Thomas has said they should take more cases and that they're being pussies about it, basically, because after Heller and DC versus Chicago, they're like most of the laws in places like New York and California are gonna have to be struck down. Like it seems like almost inescapable that these restrictive licensing regimes are not constitutional, and so rather than say that, they're just not taking the cases. But clandestinely. Oh, okay. I'm surprised the Mormon police haven't found him. Do you think you'll watch the Democrats' debates this month, later this month? You know, now that you mention that, I might if they have them in New Hampshire, I might actually go. I used to date one of the twinks who ran the cameras there. The ones they film at St. Anselm College. St. Anselm College is a mile from where I live, and I am well connected with the gay people there, with the gay students there. And that might be worth going to. But I'm sure it's heavily vetted. I would probably want to ask how come they're all horrible warmongers except for Tulsi Gabbard. I live in Connecticut, a train ride from New York City, and frequently go in the urban explorers, see museums and shows. Yeah, I have a good friend who lives in Fairfield, Connecticut, and so whenever I visit the city, I go visit him, and then I take the train the rest of the way. I have a friend in the city, and you can get a license to own a handgun sort of easily, he says, but no carry. Yeah, but even the no carry is not, the national average is now, it really is shall issue concealed carry. It really is. But I think we're at 16 states now that have constitutional carry, and then all the other ones almost, I think it's like probably, I don't know. I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but there's only about 8 or 9 states that are kind of restrictive, and all the other ones are either concealed carry or shall issue, and then there's just a couple that are discretionary issue. Um, there is like one gun store which you must buy from since you can't transport it out of the city even if you buy. Wait, you can't transport a gun out of the city? What? That's almost like a Kennesaw, Georgia type. Wouldn't they want you to transport it out? Or is that like they want to be able to keep tabs and say, well, you never, I don't know. That's crazy. Those laws should all be struck down. I mean, those are awful, terrible laws. And they're out of step with the rest of the country by, well, most of the rest of the country by quite a wide margin. It has been interesting to just see. It's kind of another, to go back to one of the meta themes of tonight's video, like of the drift, the cultural drift, because on the one hand, things like concealed carry are becoming more liberal, more laissez-faire, more accessible. If you look back to the 80s, Vermont was pretty much the only state that really permitted it other than with heavy restrictions. And now it's slowly state by state by state, starting with Florida, and then the western states, the midwestern states, upstate New England made it easier and easier and easier. And you had the first wave, which was discretionary issue, And then you have a second wave of shall issue, and then you have a third wave, which is constitutional carry, non-issue, no license required. And that's the wave. Like we're already, 16 states into that wave, and it's showing legs across the country. So you're getting it in the South, you're getting it in the Midwest, getting it in the West, and you're getting it in New England. Like I said, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine all fall into that category. So, but then there's retrenchment in the few states like California, Connecticut, New York, which are trying as best as they can to restrict it even more. But I think they're hitting major federal roadblocks, or at least, and that's even with, if Clarence Thomas is to believe, even with the Supreme Court pulling punches, which it sounds like they are when it comes to some of these laws, especially New York City's laws. They probably have a really bad district judge there too. Would be a good bet. So, any other questions? I'm getting kind of hungry, so I'm down to stay for a bit, but not for all night, obviously. That's what it is. It's not up to SCOTUS. You play the guitar? No. Nothing relevant, but what's your max deadlift? Oh, so I don't do like I do it for reps. I work in a 4 to 6 rep range on most of my lifts. So I don't really know for sure what my max would be in that situation. But right now, I do just 315, but I do it for 6 reps for four sets. So that's where my deadlift is, which means I probably can do 20 or 30 pounds more than that, but I don't know for sure. Do you shoot your guns at the range often? No. When I lived in Michigan, I could go out in the woods and shoot guns whenever I liked. In fact, I would go to my old Boy Scout camping ground and shoot them there. Since I've moved to New Hampshire, this has proved much more difficult because all the land is private, and the clubs you have to join, and they're private clubs, and so they have restrictions on how many people can join and whatnot. And I made a concerted effort to join one, and every time they called me to do an interview, I was out of state working, and they were just totally inflexible about when they would interview me. So I just said fuck it, and I stopped trying. But you're just saying if you live around here, you have to know what you have to do to stay out of jail. Yeah, it's good to know. I think most of the new gun laws a reaction to virtue signal about the liberalization everywhere. That's interesting. I haven't really thought about that, but that kind of makes sense. So you think that like more restrictive laws in something like New York or Connecticut is to say, hey, fuck you, Texas and Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, because God damn it, if you're going to make it more legal there, we're going to make it less legal here. I don't know about federal roadblocks. Seems to be moving against Heller McDonald. I feel libertarian guilt for my jealousy of the BLM land I shoot on. Colin, the last 2 years, I have drilled so many oil wells on BLM land, and I feel no guilt at all. It is interesting how many people who have never been to BLM land have all these illusions about what it means and what it's used for. I did a whole video on this called "The State and the Challenge of Desire" because so much of the ideology and the common thinking that goes into states is to kind of imagine them as some idealized form and to project whatever you want. And so a lot of people who fetishize nature and not undeservedly necessarily just imagine that if the government owns land, then it is a pristine national park. And that's not even true in the national parks, and it's certainly not true on the BLM land, which they are constantly selling grazing rights, they're selling agricultural rights, they're selling timber rights, and they're selling mineral rights. Mineral rights being usually a euphemism for oil and gas exploration. and these were the first wells that I had ever done on BLM land. But that is what it was for. And I will tell you that the oil company that wants to get the mineral rights to, a patch of land in whatever state out west are going to have way more clout than, some vegetarian, some vegan hippie who likes the idea of being able to hike and not see a derrick someplace. You read Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty. I've read, I think, the first two or three volumes, and I have heard that they just came out with volume 5. That they finally deciphered it. So I haven't. I don't think I've bought it yet, though. There's something where he had it written down in handwritten notes that nobody could read, and somebody had to go and basically, like the Rosetta Stone, learn how to read his scrawls. And once they did, they were able to translate it. Okay, so that's what you think is going on. But on the other hand, Griffin, a lot of these laws are passed in the aftermaths of mass shootings. So I do feel like, from the left wing perspective, that is what you do. Like when you have a mass shooting, you just restrict guns. Whether or not those laws have any, I mean, a lot of them have no even like practical effect. Like they don't even apply to the situations involved, but that just seems to be what you do. I mean, it's kind of the knee jerkism of the left anyway. Something happens, you pass a law, that's what you do. And it's doubly true if you don't like the idea of personal autonomy. It's triply true if you don't like the idea of the state's monopoly on violence being diffused by a gun-owning population, right? That gets in the way of your plan. So I do think that's part of it as well. Like they honestly do want gun control. I mean, I think that there's some of these, like California or New York or New Jersey or Connecticut. I think some of these states could plausibly, conceivably pass like Australia level gun restrictions if they thought they could. What are you getting for dinner? Well, I just downloaded the Domino's app, so there's a good chance I'll get that. Because I'm a man going my own way and I do not need to impress the ladies. I once invested in a company that converts coal to syngas with steam underground. It had a working power plant and passed independent and state monitoring. The Oz government didn't care, banned it. Huh? The only open cut coal for Australia. Open cut coal is in strip mine, surface mining. Do you like to cook? I no. I mean, I know how to. Sometimes I enjoy it, but I usually am too lazy, so I don't enjoy it very much. Zach, since you lived in Australia, like what percentage of the land is owned by the state? I've heard it's all Queen land. Like the Queen technically owns everything, and you're just her good subjects who live on it for her. When I cook for myself, I would be so lazy. Well, I cook for myself, just not tonight. It's fucking Saturday night in the Free State. That's what you should do, Pentazoid. You should learn how to cook really well. That'll get the ladies. You don't know the exact numbers for private ownership of land, sorry. Yeah, like rough estimate. Do they own a significant portion of the land or is most of it private? Also, how is it split between the provinces? Do the provinces own a lot of land or is it the federal government? You don't know. Pentazoid, you're a chick? That would be a huge surprise if that was true. It's called Crown Land in the British Commonwealth. It's ridiculous. But the sovereign is a queen, so it would be the queen's land, right? They don't call it that in Canada. They don't say crown lands in Canada, I don't think. Maybe. There's too few Canadian libertarians for me to know though. National Communism 666. Oh, okay. Hello. Not good with interacting with people, and I also do have the best writing and I also do not have the best writing skills, but do you think some girls do not have a lot of guys enough of a chance regardless of biology? Yeah, well that's I guess the Twitter stats are that the bottom 15% of girls compete for the bottom 85% of guys. So, uh, you could always get lucky to find someone who you just match up with just right. That does happen, but um, it is like a really, really terrible game of musical chairs. Also, not good with interacting, not the best writing skills. These are all things that you can improve. Do you find it surprising? I am not offended. Wait, are you for real a female? I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I mean, I know I had female. I mean, Poe the Person's a female, and there was this lady who did Mises videos who was a female. So like, I guess I. But when I look at the analytics, which isn't that often, it's like 98% male. I mean, I can't Pentazoid. I can't really see your icon, so I don't know. I think Pentazoid was being serious. Pentazoid 111 is a girl. Holy cow! This is like amazing. The continued popularity of the British monarchy blows my mind. It doesn't blow my mind, but I do find it very strange. And when I visited there, I found it very strange that it seems to cut across most political divisions. So obviously conservatives are very, very pro monarchy and proudly so, but even a lot of like left wing people and some of the left wingers that I got to know, very left wing people, so out and out socialist, were like very much in love with the queen, and they were like, I will do whatever she commands, and they're always like, it's the perfect system because she controls the military, but she doesn't have any political power, and she can't make any laws, but she is the sovereign, and there's so much social proof and conservative bias there that it's just kind of nauseating. Oh, and which we have here in the United States is just conservative for a different thing. Um, but yeah, I've always found that horribly antiquated. Like, why? It's clear that you don't need a king or a queen. And I've even heard reports that she would just assume retire. Although when she says retire, she's still imagining that she gets to keep all the castles and palaces and everything. So if they said, oh, "Hey, here's your one-room apartment. This is how you get to Zach." 23% state-owned, 63% private, 14% native. Title in 1993. Oh, well, that's quite a lot of private land then. I remember an old video of yours where you talked about World War II as the basis of a kind of new American civic religion, and I think that helps explain why a lot of progressives are cool with war. Yes, I did do videos on that. That is actually a term that I heard from Scott Horton, who I hope to meet at Porcfest coming up here. And I do think that. Um, I think that we have two competing civic religions in the United States. We have the Founding Fathers Bill of Rights, Constitution, Revolution, right, which has a lot of rhetoric that many people still agree with and still find very compelling, and it's kind of has left and still has a big imprint on the national character. But then that mentality had an explicitly, strongly anti-government bent. Very like the governments are necessary evils, that they should be minimal, and this is even if we're talking about people like Alexander Hamilton or James Madison. let alone people like Thomas Jefferson uh, or Patrick Henry, so or John Randolph, so of Roanoke. So it didn't all happen in World War II. It's kind of happened in World War One. It happened a little bit in the Civil War. But this progressive idea that the state is this enormously powerful force, which indeed it is, but a one that's potentially good, that can do a lot of good, and in fact should do a lot of good. Like there's a lot of things that we are obligated to do in the world. A lot of this is messianic. A lot of this is like the United States has a mission in the world, and that mission can only not only is it best performed by a vigorous state, it can only be performed by a vigorous state. And so that is fundamentally at odds with the original idea of the United States. And so this new alternative civic religion, which again had antecedents, it didn't start then, but this is kind of when it got codified. And World War II is the centerpiece of this. Oh, look at this, heroic deed, which is not so heroic when you look at the logistics involved, right? Like, no, I'm not saying that there weren't heroic soldiers and brilliant generals and whatever, but just if you look at the balance of power between the warring states involved, it wasn't. It was kind of a foregone conclusion, basically. Um, and oh, look, and you'll get this like when it comes right when conservatives really press liberals on the socialism thing. The liberals, if they're smart and they do this, I've seen Michael Moore do this. Like, hey, World War II, buddy. And unfortunately, conservatives, unless they're Pat Buchanan, can't say, yeah, World War II was a shitstorm. Yet, yes, I agree. World War II was an example of socialism, and World War II was the worst time ever. So, yes, there is a competing civic religion, and World War II is the founding event in that. I do understand there are biological factors in male and female relationships, but I also think there's cultural and other dynamics at play, and I think a lot of cases guys get a really raw deal. I agree with all of that, but that doesn't mean if you want a woman, if you need a woman in your life, if that's what it's going to take for you to be happy or to have a family, you need to find a way to navigate that. That's as simple as it is. And the thing is also that most people are such incredible underachievers, whether we're talking about their physical abilities or just their work or their mental abilities, that if you just get focused and work on it, you can distinguish yourself in almost every respect from everybody else. So you have a fighting chance if you're willing to fight. If you're not willing to fight, you're fucked. You're not fucked, but you're literally just hoping on dumb luck. Yeah, Obama was a horrible warmonger. There's evidence that Obama knew better. In some of his speeches and some of his writing, it shows that he probably understood that the wars, especially in Afghanistan and Iraq, had no real winnable goal, no achievable goal that could be articulated in any kind of politically palatable way. And rather than look weak or look like he was losing a war or whatever, he just doubled down. Now, the generals and the right wingers, like the McCains of the world, were demanding he do much more, and he kind of met them halfway and did half more. But that is an enormous amount of blood on his hands, and he's a piece of shit. I mean, there's just no question about it. Donald, and Bush is worse, but I think at least Bush was kind of sort of sincere. Like he didn't pretend to be the peace candidate. He didn't pretend to be an enlightened restraint. He ran on that. He ran on a humble foreign policy, but when push came to shove, he had showed no compunction about doing it. So I hate them both. I mean, Bush had worse effects, but Obama is the more sinister, I think. Mm. I bought a book, Moral Republic by Edward Day Watts. Good read. World War II civic religion was started by Wilson. There's a very good argument for that. Although, again, progressivism didn't start with Wilson. Again, you can always point to earlier antecedents. Um, and you can, I mean, this can go all the way back to the Puritans. This can go back to Plymouth Rock, if not before. But whenever anti-war left, whoa, 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 whoa. Have you been exposed to Peter Zalen? Any opinions on him? Now, if I'm remembering this right, is he the one who's is like wrote books like Accidental Superpower, who's basically saying the geopolitical position of the United States is just so fundamentally strong that come what may, it's just guaranteed to be a world power? Is that Peter Zan? I think it is, right? Yes, that's the one. So I think he might be right about like just the kind of the positioning on the North American continent of this hegemonic society is just extremely advantageous. The other countries do have advantages. Like Russia has more natural resources, and China has this huge population, but they're kind of all stacked against each other. They're perpetually in competition. Um, I don't necessarily agree with his policy. I haven't read his books, by the way. I've watched a couple hours of his lectures and read about him, but I'm not an expert. Um, you kind of have this weird with the Columbian Exchange. You kind of had this weird thing where the Western Hemisphere uh, was kind of able to be rounded up into a couple really big states without a lot of history. So that's never going to happen in Europe because you have all these different groups that don't like each other. Yeah, he discussed me, but his arguments seem strong. See, I don't know much about his prescriptive. I don't know if he's a. I'm assuming he's an interventionist, but I don't know that. If he is, then yes, that's disgusting. Yes, the anti-war left was pro-war once Stalin was involved. There's a famous example of them changing a speech halfway through. Uh, ran as a compassionate conservatism. Yeah, there's nothing conservative about him. Medicare. It was the biggest. It was the biggest expansion of government involvement in the medical industry up until Obamacare. So they're really the old right really died with World War II. I mean, some of those men survived, people like Taft, but they were the leftovers, and the people whose political careers began after World War II were consistently of the new civic religion. Right? You didn't have old guard constitutionalists anymore until you got Ron Paul and Justin Amash. To be perfectly honest, and so they have always just been progressives as Michael Malice says, progressives going the speed limit, not ideologically really opposed. Again, with exceptions like people like Ron Paul, Justin Amash, but they are exceptional in that regard. Uh, bu- 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 Obama wanted his domestic agenda, so it would go along to get along. Yeah, I don't want to make excuses for him though, right? He had control of well, at least one of the houses of, the idea that he couldn't have gotten stuff passed if he didn't like like the Republicans would refuse to pass Obamacare if he didn't go to war. And he was such a fucking liar when it came to Obamacare anyway. Holy shit. What a shit show that was. I appreciate your advice and answer, and I will make an attempt to improve myself. But I would like to say I do try a lot, and there are various issues that I have but food advice. So, National Communist, I don't know you at all, and I don't know, I mean, I don't know what your goals are or whatnot, but here's one way to look at it. There's a lot of shit in the world, and there's a lot of things that you just cannot control, but your life and your body are the ones that you can control the most. And that's even true if you do have legitimate issues, right? There are people who do have health conditions, who have injuries, who have they might be in financial straits or whatever, and they can't join a gym. Like I understand that there are situations that are can make it more difficult for some people, but even with those impediments, you have more control over yourself than other people. And I just know that there's so many who are unsatisfied with their body and unsatisfied with their health and their level of fitness, and they literally spend year after year after year sulking about it and understanding that it's holding them back, right? That the fact that they have a teardrop shape or a big gut or love handles or whatever it is, and that this is really being an impediment to their dating life or whatnot, and yet 3 or 4 years on into their moping, they haven't done anything about it. Uh, so I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that it happens overnight, but it is something that you can do. And if it is a goal that you have, then you should do it. Just start doing it. And um, like one of the book that I found the most helpful was called Bigger, Leaner, Stronger by Mike Matthews. Very easy to read. He made good arguments based on empiricism. Don't have to agree with everything that he says, and there are certainly other good sources. But I mean, I read his book and I lost 60 pounds, and I got a lot stronger than I was before. So I do recommend people read his book. Not that he's the only source on this; he certainly isn't. But it's a kind of a brief but good, thorough overview of diet and exercise and what you can do to advance your goals. It's not rocket science. It does take an investment of time. It does take some commitment, but these are all things that people can and should do. Seems like the majority of libertarians are so overwhelmingly male, but every time I went to Porcfest, it was 50-50 male female. Um, yeah, but David Friedman commented that that is unusual, that he noticed that as well, and I think it's because a lot of families go. I'm not sure why that would be, but Porkfest is the most sexually balanced libertarian event in the world, basically. I don't know if Zayn is prescriptively interventionist, but he has the "it's inevitable" line. Yeah, that's kind of the most bullshit pragmatism I can imagine, right? Just we have to. It just assumes that we have to, or else what? Or else China and Russia will get in a war with each other and fuck each other up big time. We watched this happen in World War One. We watched this happen all through the 19th century, right? When Napoleon was tearing up, and it was nothing but good for us to not be involved. If we hadn't been involved in World War II, Hitler and Stalin would have destroyed each other. They both would have become phenomenally weaker. That's what I believe. That's the most likely scenario. And then our hands wouldn't have been bloodied. It's true. A lot of families go. A lot of families do go. Well, it's a camp. It's a camping event, and I don't know. And because it's in New Hampshire, and you already have a lot of families here, a lot of them go. In fact, I remember talking to one of these guys. I don't remember his name, but he was upset because Ian Freeman was barred, and he actually gave a speech saying how wrong it was that Ian Freeman was barred. But he said, I wasn't going to come, but my kids would not stand for it. My kids wanted to come, so he had to come because of his kids. So, this is like, and think about it. If you're a libertarian and you have kids, if you have children, what can you do as a family? And this is like it. So, yeah, there you go. I don't know if it's 50-50 male and female, though. Could be. Anyone has heard of the Kanzuk Union? I have not. I have never heard of that. Progressivism could probably go back to Roman history. The Roman conquerors were trying to shepherd the primitive British people into their image. Well, I mean, you can always find earlier antecedents, but if you start to go far enough back, and it becomes increasingly less likely that they're relevant. The line is direct because there's always outside influences. Uh, so it's kind of like you can trace your ancestry back and say, hey, this person is my great grandfather 200 times over. But by the time it gets to you, it's mixed in with so many other people that how much is right, how much of the original is there. So there might be something to that, but I think progressivism as we know it now has a much stronger founding in like the puritanical New Englandism and the post-Civil War millennialism and progressivism. Because the Civil War was also very important. A lot of people, this was the first time that the federal government was actively involved in a lot of people's lives. And a lot of people said, hey, look how powerful we were when we came together. You had a lot of people in the military who said, hey, we should keep a standing army perpetually because look how great it did in the Civil War. There was a big problem because before the Civil War, they didn't really have that. And that didn't really come to fruition until after World War One, really after World War Two. But you still had a lot of people talking about it, and so instead of this idea of the founders that a standing army is necessarily bad, not only is it expensive, but it's a threat to liberty. After the Civil War, you had a lot of professional soldiers who were like, "Hey, no, this is actually not a bad idea. We should have this." I have no idea how common this is or what the best tools are to stretch outwards. Kind of afraid to ask. Stretch outwards. Go ahead and ask. I'm not even sure what you're talking about. Lincoln had a bunch of newspapers that criticized him shut down. Yeah, there's a good book on this called Lincoln's Critics. He had congressmen thrown in prison and then exiled to Canada. Congressman Vallandigham, or was it Governor Vallandigham? Um, yeah. Suspended habeas corpus. He did a lot of shit in the border states, arresting people, martial law, all kinds of stuff. He was a tyrant. Now, I will say in his defense that I don't think that he was truly power hungry in the sense that he wanted those powers or that he was selfishly motivated. I think he honestly believed that he was vested with these powers legally and righteously, and that he was just doing his job as president, and that this was not something that he actively wanted. Which is not an excuse. That's not to say that he shouldn't be condemned, but he is very different than, say, an FDR, who I think actively wanted a war, actively wanted to be a great president, actively would do or say anything to accrue as much power as possible. And I don't think Lincoln was kind of in the same mold as that at all, which again is not an excuse for what he did or didn't do. There's a fascinating conspiracy theory too that he manipulated the South into firing first at Fort Sumter. That there was this question, the secession had happened, the question of who would start hostilities, because there was a big problem that a lot of people did not think that secession was illegal. Even people like William Stewart had said that we have a voluntary union, and if they want to leave, then they want to leave, and we can't force them. And some would even say that there's a good book on this called The Union of the Sword, and basically the premise is that many Unionists were terrified of secession because they thought to stop secession, the Union would end because they would have to coerce the southern states to remain. And then they say, well, this isn't a voluntary union. This is like a couple that got married. They try and separate, and the husband beats the shit out of his wife and locks her up in the basement and says, we're still married. That's essentially what happened. And there were people before the Civil War, and I mentioned here Seward, of course, but there were others, even people like Grant before the war, who thought we should not do this. Like, we want them to stay, but we don't. We think if we force them to stay, it will ruin the whole point anyway. Um, and it was the South Carolina garrison in Charleston firing on Fort Sumter being construed as an aggressive act. Now, this is ridiculous. South Carolina has seceded. They were trying to peaceably resolve that issue as well as they could, and Lincoln was refusing. And so there's a good lecture the Mises Institute did with a John Dennison. I think it's entitled subtitle like "The Cost of Wars and Lincoln." There's some evidence that he tried to engineer an attack there, but I don't think that's necessary to point that he could have honestly just believed, hey, this is a federal impost, this is a federal facility, I'm not allowing it to go under, and eventually the South Carolinians said, well, it's where we left, and you have no rights here anymore. Thank you to representative democracy. And I think it is kind of, I mean, people who are like, haha, the South fired first. And I'm like, yeah, onto their own harbor for all intents and purposes. But FDR had a history with the Japanese that predates his political career. I'm not aware of that history. Uh, I know that his one of his ancestors on the Delano side had a history in China, made his money in China. There were a lot of his family were in the China trade, so called, before the Opium Wars on the Delano side. You might be thinking of that. There were a whole bunch of New Englanders who became very wealthy in the China trade uh, in the lead up to and after the Opium Wars, and Roosevelt's Delano relatives were in there among that. But there might be a Japanese connection too. I'm just not aware of. Completely possible. All right, guys, it's been 2 hours. Anything else? It's definitely pizza time now. Maybe I think the Japanese attacked the Chinese and he was pissed off with them for that. Well, yes, there was a Japo Sino-Japanese war in Korea before I want to say before the Russo-Japanese War or maybe right after. Um, but there was a Boxer Rebellion in China and Japanese and Americans were involved in that on the same side. The Japanese and Chinese got into war in 1937, and then earlier than that, there was a war in Manchuria. The Japanese basically colonized Manchuria and created a puppet state called Manchukuo, and they installed the last Qing emperor Puyi as the king or emperor of Manchukuo. But at that time, there wasn't really a nationalist government in control of all of China, and when the Japanese invaded Manchukuo, they were fighting warlords. And the main one in Manchuria at the time was a guy named Zhang Julin, and he eventually just said, "Well, I'm not going to fight," and they kind of formed an alliance. Um, so there were a lot of people in the U.S. who were pissed about what was happening in China with the Japanese from 1931 on. But that does not predate Roosevelt's political career because he was already like the governor of New York by then. And 1895 China-Jap War. Yeah, okay, yeah. I thought it was before the Russia-Japanese War. Uh, yeah. There were China had a history of U.S. not only U.S. commerce but U.S. missionaries going there, and so like there's always kind of been this connection. And Roosevelt's family had traded there. I don't know if they were still doing it that late. Um, but it's not entirely impossible that like some of his money that he inherited came from that. Um, but yeah, many Americans were upset with what was happening vis-a-vis Japan and China throughout the 30s. And when you get to 1937, that's when the nationalist Chinese and the Japanese actually start fighting. Uh, kind of, kind of provoked by Chiang. Now, obviously, the Japanese were occupying a big part of China at the time in Manchukuo. Uh, Chiang, Chiang basically attacked their holdings around Shanghai, and it was just a terrible, horrible disaster because then the war, instead of being in northern China, which is relatively unpopulated, it happened right in the Yangtze Valley, where most people lived and the richest part of the country. And basically, Chiang is compared to Mao, I would pick Chiang over Mao any day, but Chiang is really one of the worst leaders ever. Not in terms of his ability, he was actually quite shrewd and had some principles, but he was more than willing to sacrifice or condemn tens of millions of Chinese to be victims based on kind of shrewd political calculations. And that's exactly what he did when he provoked the Japanese. Now, provoked is in quotes, but he was under a lot of pressure. Nationalist Chinese people thought it was an affront that the Japanese were taking over Manchuria. And he was under enormous pressure to, quote, do something about it. And he knew very well that the nationalist government was not put together enough, did not have the military wherewithal, did not have the economic control over the country to actually do that effectively. Yes, China was very large and had a big population, so it was a war the Japanese ultimately couldn't win by direct conquest, but it was a war where they could win most of the battles and inflict untold damage, in which they did. I mean, the only country that received more damage, in the period was the Soviet Union during World War II. China is the only country that's a comparable second. and if you go past that, they don't even come close. But not sure if there's any truth to this, but supposedly the slave trade returned to Libya after the overthrow. Yes, this is true. It's on Instagram. There's videos about it. There's reports on it. Slave trade, it's 100% back in Libya. Thank you very much, Hillary Clinton. Thank you. I know your resume to be president was so important to you that replacing a secular dictator with, Muslim rebels who are sure to enslave the blacks and kill the gays is, the best we can hope for from you. Yeah, slavery is. I mean, look, slavery is approved of in the Bible, but we've had a Reformation, and like by 1000 AD, slavery was not popular within Christianity, and like the stuff that happened in the United States later was kind of aberrant from that. In Islam, it's continued to be a respectable practice for a very long time. So yes, there's a slave trade in Libya, and it's because Hillary Clinton wanted to be president, and she thought it would look good on her resume. Earlier I was talking about people joining the Boy Scouts to get Eagle. It's because it will look good on their resume. Well, she topples dictators and reinstitutes slavery to look good on her resume. She's the most qualified woman for the position ever, as I was told last night by my date. Anyway, guys, I think that is going to be it for me tonight because I am getting quite hungry. So thank you all for watching. Thank you, visitor, for the donation. I always appreciate it. And have you guys have a good night. Cheers.